We've been in a series in our study of the Sermon on the Mount called Deeper Obedience, looking at the instructions of Jesus to us about how we should think about the law of God in the Old Testament. Jesus began this section of his sermon by emphasizing, first of all, the authority of God's laws. He says at the outset, "Don't think for a second that I've come to abolish the law of God, to set aside what God has said in the Old Testament." Get that idea out of your heads immediately. Jesus does not disagree with the Old Testament commands. Rather, he disagrees with the way the Jewish leaders have applied them and how they've sort of found loopholes around the obvious intention of God's commands. And so repeatedly in this section, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said," and then he sort of sets his teaching alongside the Old Testament commands. So the law says this, that's good. Now let me explain to you the intent behind that command and how you should obey both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And so Jesus in this section, he's sort of working his way through the 10 commandments as he's teaching us how to think about obedience to God's commands. He's urging us as his followers to consider the intent of each command and then seek to obey the spirit of the law sincerely, as opposed to looking for sort of technicalities and loopholes in the commands. So far, we've seen Jesus teach about the command not to murder, first of all. Then he addressed the command not to commit adultery. And then sort of within that, he talked about the command against coveting your neighbor's wife. Now he's here addressing the command not to take the Lord's name in vain and not to bear false witness. It's sort of a 2-for-1 here. And we'll pick up the text now in Matthew chapter 5, verse 33, where Jesus says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn.'" Now, we're going to need to look at the Old Testament commands on this about oaths, and we'll get there in a minute. But basically, this is a summary statement of what God had said in the Old Testament. You shall not swear falsely. If you make an oath, you shall perform that oath. Now, God never told people to do this. God never said, you shall swear oaths. What he said is, if you swear an oath, a vow to do something, you better follow through on that. Verse 34, Jesus continues, "I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil." Now, I know you might be here looking at this text and you might be thinking, well, here's a part of the Sermon on the Mount where I'm finally doing okay. In fact, I can't remember the last time that I swore by Jerusalem, so I think I'm good here. I can just sort of sit back, ignore this sermon. This one isn't for me. And while a sort of surface level reading of the text might seem that simple, I think there's a lot more going on here if you really grasp what Jesus is calling us to. We all use words. I think this is a sermon really for everyone in this room. We have a crisis of credibility today. It's why we have to have, dozens and dozens of pages of contracts whenever you purchase a house. You can't just shake hands because you can't trust that the person will follow through. This credibility crisis is why we have to put people under oath with the threat of perjury, or they have to sign a sworn affidavit, because you can't just trust what people say. You need things in writing. You need things confirmed by a document with clear consequences for lying. Otherwise, we really can't trust what someone says to us. Now, this is true of every sort of communication, from headlines in mainstream media outlets to daily conversations that you engage in at work. People lie all the time. People manipulate and spin things. And this creates the world we live in today, where you basically can't really trust anything that someone tells you. And if we're honest, each of us at times has contributed to this credibility crisis. Now, before we examine the teaching of our Lord here, we need to back up and first understand the context into which Jesus is speaking. Jesus, of course, is teaching Jewish people in Israel living in the first century. And so we sort of need to familiarize ourselves with the Jewish practice as it relates to oaths and vows. Now, the Old Testament commands on this subject were very clear and straightforward. Here's an example. We could look at Deuteronomy, we could look at Leviticus, we could look at several other places. Here's just one. Numbers chapter 30, verse 1. Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the people of Israel, saying, "This is what the Lord has commanded. If a man vows a vow to the Lord, or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." So that's pretty simple. The command is, if you vow something, if you promise, especially if you invoke the name of the Lord, you better keep your word. And there's all sorts of examples of this in the Old Testament. We won't take time to look at those, but even if you've just read through Genesis, you've seen this many times throughout even just that first book of the Bible. People will say things like, "As the Lord lives, I will do this." And the implication is that by invoking the name of God, you're basically saying, if I fail to keep my word to you, I invite a curse from God upon my head. And so these oaths were only to be made in the most serious of circumstances, not flippantly. And if you swore an oath, you better be telling the truth. This was used in making promises and also in testifying to something that has already happened. For example, if I went to the courtroom in ancient Israel and I said, "My neighbor stole my ox, and I swear by the name of Yahweh, I saw him do it." Okay, that would be an example of sort of an oath being used to confirm a statement. God gave several commands in the Old Testament regulating this, but they all have the same basic intent. Keep your word. If you swear, if you use God's name, you better be speaking the truth. Don't use God's name in vain. Don't borrow the name of God just to add credibility to your statements unless you're being completely honest and straightforward. Don't bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, as with most of the commands of the Old Testament, the Jewish leadership had come up with a set of rules and regulations about this that managed to sort of miss the entire intent of God's law. They took these commands, like the one we just read in Numbers, to mean that if you swore using God's name, that was a binding oath. You had to fulfill it. But if you swore by something sort of associated with God, but you didn't actually invoke the name of God, then it maybe isn't binding. And so they had developed this complex system of things that you could swear by and you were really on the hook for that, and then other things that if you swore by them, it didn't really matter too much if you kept your word. Let me show you what I mean. Jesus addressed this exact issue in Matthew 23, where he says to the scribes and Pharisees, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing." So swearing by the temple, no big deal. If you lied, then it's not really a problem. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. Oh man, you better keep your word then. Verse 17, "You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, then he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. Whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it," speaking of God. "And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it." So here's the point. The Jews had come up with, once again, what they thought were loopholes around God's law. Instead of swearing by God's name, they would swear by things associated with God so that people would take their statement seriously. But since they didn't technically use God's name in their oath, they didn't think that they were really bound to it. It's like when children say, my promise doesn't count because I had my fingers crossed behind my back. It's sort of a stupid, silly way around keeping your word. But more than that, it was even blasphemous. Because by swearing by the temple or the altar or whatever holy thing associated with God, you're still borrowing God's reputation to add credibility to your lie. It was a way of using the glory, the heaviness of God to deceive others. And so Jesus comes along and says, stop it. In my kingdom, I want simple, clear, honest communication. Instead of, I swear by the gold of the temple, just say yes. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could just trust what people said? If you could shake someone's hand and sell them your house and that was that. If you lived in a society where everyone just told the truth, if everyone just spoke straightforwardly and kept their word 100% of the time. And Jesus is saying that's exactly the kind of society that I'm here to create. Remember, this sermon that we call the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew calls it preaching and teaching the kingdom of God at the end of Matthew 4. This is what living as a citizen in Christ's kingdom looks like. These are the principles, the practical instructions of living a life under the rule of Jesus. And as Christ's rule spreads throughout the world, this is where we're headed. This is the end destination. A world in which people say what they mean and mean what they say, and you can trust their words. So the kingdom ideal is really incredible to think about. A community so saturated with truth that oaths and swearing, all of that becomes unnecessary. Because when you think about it, an oath, what it is it's sort of a way of backing up what you say. So maybe to use an illustration, if you look at your money, it might say somewhere, this is backed by the full credit of the U.S. government or something like that. And technically that's supposed to be backed by gold somewhere in a mine, but I think we've way exceeded that. But anyways, it's supposed to be backed by something. There's something solid behind this piece of paper that makes it worth something. And that's what we do with oaths, with promises, with swearing. I'm telling you something, and then to sort of make it more credible, I'm going to use this oath. I'm going to use this swearing, this promise. And what Jesus says is your character should be the thing that backs up your words. Your reputation should be so reliable that people simply take you at your word because you're the one saying it. Now, I don't think Jesus is here necessarily issuing an absolute prohibition against every possible oath in every circumstance, okay? Some people have sort of read it that way. The Quakers, for example, they refuse to even, when they're sworn into Congress or something, back in the day, they would refuse to swear to anything because they thought that that's what Jesus required. I think that's taking it a little bit too far because of the rest of Scripture. For example, God himself swears oaths at times. For example, Hebrews 6. When God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, "Surely I will bless you and multiply you." And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. So there's an example where God himself makes an oath. Jesus, when he's on trial in Matthew 26, he is put under oath and he responds in that way. Paul called God as witness multiple times for things he said in his epistles. So solemn vows, things like in a courtroom setting or even in a marriage when you're making an oath, a promise, I don't think those sorts of things are condemned here. The context Jesus is speaking into here is the sort of casual, everyday swearing that tries to create an escape hatch for deception. So I don't think Jesus is saying you should refuse to take an oath when you're required to, by the state in the courtroom. Rather, he's saying you shouldn't feel the need to use oaths to bolster your word. Your character should be the thing that adds credibility to what you say. Jesus here is drawing a contrast to the Jewish rabbis' view. They said certain oaths were binding, others were not. If you swear by the temple, that's binding. If you swear by the gold on the temple, well, that's not a big deal. If you make an oath invoking the name of God, then you better keep your word. But if you swear by things sort of associated with God, with the temple, with worship, then that's not binding. And here's what Jesus says to that. He says, every word you speak is binding, even if you aren't swearing by anything. If you find yourself regularly needing to sort of add something like, I promise, I swear, on my grandmother's grave, if you regularly have to sort of add something like that to your statements to convince people, that's an indication that you're not credible. So what Jesus is really calling us to here is credibility, to be people whose words carry weight, so that we can simply say yes or no. And people take us at our word. People believe us without us having to add some sort of oath to clarify that we actually mean what we're saying this time. And so this leads to the practical questions. How do you do this? How can you become someone who is credible, whose words are taken seriously? And here are 7 ways that you can do this. 7 things that the Bible tells us will cause people to listen to us more and take our words more seriously. Number 1. Let your words be few. The more you speak, the less people tend to listen. The more you speak, the less others will take your words seriously. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 says, "Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay." So we're instructed here to not be hasty with our words, to let our words be few. Proverbs repeatedly teaches us that even a fool is considered wise if he holds his peace. For example, Proverbs 17 verse 28 says, "Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent." Some of the reason your word may not be credible and people maybe don't trust your promises is you're just way too quick to speak. Speak fewer words, and the words you do speak will carry more weight. So, first of all, let your words be few. Secondly, let your words be true. Commit to radical truthfulness, even in small matters. Build a track record of being a truth teller all the time, every time, even when it costs you. Admit when you do something wrong. Don't be defensive. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25. "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor. We are members one of another." You build credibility by always speaking the truth. Third, let your words be you. Meaning, say what you actually think. Be straightforward with people. You want to build credibility, you want to have your words be believed by others, have a reputation of what you say to someone's face is what you say behind their back. Because when people start to see that difference, when they hear that you said this about somebody and then they see you say something totally different in other contexts, they don't forget that. That sticks in people's minds, and they begin to form a picture of you as not a credible person, someone whose words cannot be taken at face value. Let your words be authentic. 2 Corinthians 1, verse 12. "For our boast is this, the testimony of our conscience, that we behaved in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God, and supremely so towards you." Proverbs has much to say on the subject of flattery. Flattery is just polite lying. Let your words actually reflect what you are thinking. Speak genuine words. Number 4, let your words be glue. I apologize, I had to. I rarely get these sudden bursts of creativity, and then I tend to get carried away. Let your words be glue. Stick to what you say you're going to do. Let your words be binding. Follow through relentlessly on what you say you're going to do. People should know that when you make a commitment, it will be done. In other words, part of your words being trusted is your actions following through. Build a track record of consistency. One of my favorite passages on this is Psalm chapter 15, beginning with verse 1. It says, "O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who swears to his own hurt and does not change." Notice that last phrase. Part of being someone who is blameless in God's sight, who is a truth teller, is that your words are binding. You swear, you make a commitment, and then later on, maybe you really regret it. And you say, boy, I shouldn't have agreed to do that. I'm in a tough spot here. It's going to cost me to keep this commitment. And yet you follow through anyway because your word is your bond. That's what it means to swear to your own hurt and not change. Even when it gets really difficult to keep your word. To say, nope, I made a commitment. I'm keeping this. Let your words be glue. Number 5, let your words be dew. Be thoughtful about when to speak. Proverbs 15, verse 23 says, "To make an apt answer is a joy to a man, and a word in season, how good it is." Sometimes we speak true things at the wrong times, and our words are not taken very seriously because of the timing. So here's an example in my own life where I'm trying to follow this principle. I'll leave it to others how successfully I'm doing. I just got a new job a few months back. The company I was working for kind of went bankrupt, and so I had to find a new place to work. I was hired in as a supervisor at sort of a pretty decent-sized company, and I've been working there since December. I have a lot of opinions about things at this organization. I see inefficiencies, I see problems all over the place. I have all sorts of ideas about how processes could be improved. I have ideas about certain people in certain positions that are a problem. And I'm fully aware that nobody is interested in hearing any of that from me because I've been there 3 months. Now, at some point, if I'm asked my take on something, I'll certainly be happy to provide it. But sometimes your words are not taken seriously simply because you're speaking at the wrong time. Let your words be dew. Number 6, let your words be subdued. Exercise restraint in what you say and in how you say it. Resist the temptation to exaggerate. Even on little things, I think this is important. When you're telling a story, and you want to add some dramatic flair, and so you just sort of stretch it a little bit. If you want people to take what you say at face value and believe your words and find you to be credible, when you speak, make sure that everything you say is straightforward. Your words should be considered unquestionably reliable and accurate. Part of being subdued with your words, being careful, exercising restraint, is not making hasty promises that you can't actually keep. Proverbs 25, verse 14 says, "Like clouds and wind without rain is a man who boasts of a gift he does not give." It really doesn't matter how sincerely you say something if you can't keep your word in the end. You still lose credibility, even if you really meant it at the time. So let your words be subdued. Proverbs 17, verse 27. "Whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding." Don't make promises just to please someone if you can't follow through in the end. Similarly, don't make idle threats. Think before you speak, and make sure that you mean what you are saying. So let your words be few. Let your words be true. Let your words be you. Speak authentically. Let your words be glue. Let them be binding. Let your words be dew in due season at an appropriate time. Let your words be subdued. And then lastly, number 7, let your words be see-through. Speak transparently without manipulation or spin. Here's what one commentator writes about Jesus' rebuke here in Matthew 5. This is Dallas Willard in The Divine Conspiracy. He says, "The essence of the swearing that Jesus targets here is about invoking something or someone else, especially God, to make your words seem more significant and weighty. The aim is to impress others with your seriousness or piety so that you get what you want. It's a device of manipulation designed to override the judgment or input of others in order to possess them for our purposes. It's manipulation, or, as we say in our culture, spin. And Jesus says it's evil. Instead of loving and honoring others with truthfulness, the intent is to get one's way by verbal manipulation of the thoughts and choices of others." Now, in case you're not seeing the connection to what Jesus says in our text here, let me give you a modern-day example of this sort of thing, and then we'll step back and maybe you'll understand what the Jews are doing here when they invoke holy things in their oaths. Think about commercials. Commercials you see on television or nowadays, I guess, in apps. My wife and I were watching the Super Bowl together a few weeks ago. I don't generally watch commercials ever. I hate being advertised to. It just bugs me. But sometimes Super Bowl commercials are clever or something, kind of funny, entertaining, and so I decided, whatever, we'll watch these. And Catherine can confirm this. I'm kind of a commercial critic when I'm watching commercials. I'll point out when it's just a dumb commercial. I hate when commercials don't really explain what the product does, or the commercial really sometimes has nothing to do with the product or service that they're advertising. They've got Peyton Manning playing ping pong, and then at the end of the commercial, you find out it's for toothpaste. And you're like, what does that have to do with anything? It's all just manipulation. Often these commercials will have things happening totally unrelated to the product, but they put you in a sort of positive headspace so that you then associate certain things that you like with their product. So here's a ridiculous example of this. Real commercial. A Coca-Cola commercial where you see children playing in a field, laughing, and then it cuts to some polar bears cuddling, this adorable little family of polar bears, and then it's a commercial for Coca-Cola. Now, none of that has anything to do with Coca-Cola. It's emotional manipulation. It's invoking the positive thoughts and feelings that you have about those things, and then trying to associate them with this carbonated drink that's terrible for your health. So they're using the positive emotions you have of children playing and, oh, look at these adorable polar bears or whatever, and then trying to connect that with what they're trying to sell you. And the Jews were doing something very similar. By evoking the name of God or the temple or things associated with the worship of God, they were, in their day, using the esteem that people had for those weighty things to bolster their statements. It was emotional manipulation. And we do this sometimes today. Here's, I think, a way modern Christians sometimes invoke God's name to add credibility to their statements by saying, God called me to do this. God's leading me to do this thing. And it becomes a trump card where you just sort of have to get on board with whatever it is that they're saying. Now, sometimes God does lead people to do things. I'm not saying that never happens. But man, we really ought to be very limited and careful when we use such statements, because often it becomes a way of manipulating people. By invoking God's name and tying that to the thing that you've decided to do, it's a real clever way of just shutting down any opposition to what you're doing. Here's a summary of Jesus' teaching. He says, you don't need to add weight to your words with an oath if your words already carry weight. That's how we could understand his basic point. Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. If people doubt what you are saying to the point that you feel the need to say regularly, I swear, I'm telling the truth here, that speaks to a lack of credibility that you have. And Christ followers are to be known as truth tellers. Our words should be credible. We'll close this morning with a summary of this section from commentator Michael Green. He says, time and again in the Old Testament, God had insisted that oaths were to be honored and kept. The scribes devised a variety of escape clauses from binding oaths. Any oath which succeeded in avoiding the name of God was not absolutely binding. One could swear by one's head, by Jerusalem, by heaven, by earth, and so on. God was not thought of as a partner in such a transaction, so to break faith was not serious. Jesus shows how frivolous and essentially sinful this attitude is. Our words should be trustworthy. As citizens of the kingdom, oaths are required only because people are so often liars. Let them not be required among disciples.